All right, let's get started. Thank you all for coming in on this very rainy day. Before we get started, just a reminder to please silence your phones. And I also wanted to let you know about a few other speaker events we have coming up in this very busy month of March. Starting this Wednesday, for those of you who are interested in local history, which I'm assuming is everybody, we have another book talk for The Good War of Consul Reeves, which is the fictionalized story of the British consul in neutral Macau during World War II, who found himself in a situation he never expected. A book talk on March 18th, that's next Monday, for Party Life, Chinese Governance and the World Beyond Liberalism by Eric Lee. Followed by on Tuesday, we have a club lunch about the shipping industry and Hong Kong's role in a changing environment, featuring our own Tim Huxley and a panel of other distinguished speakers in the shipping industry. That's next Tuesday. And then on Monday the 25th, we have a club screening for a documentary called Century of Women, which follows 5 women who are 100 years or older, who come from Cuba, Israel, Austria, India, and Turkey, and we'll talk about how their experiences reflect the social changes in the world over the past 100 years. But for today, we're very pleased to have with us author and 40-year FCC member Vaudine England.
I was very young, really, very young. But it is 40 years.
Vaudine was a journalist for 3 decades in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong for the BBC, Reuters, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and several London newspapers. She has authored several books about individuals, institutions, and family companies in Hong Kong, the most recent of which is the book we're talking about today, Fortune's Bazaar, The Making of Hong Kong, which was published last May. Now based in Amsterdam, she is completing a PhD in Asian history at Leiden University and is a co-founding director of the archives and history-making consultancy, History Inc. Limited. Thank you so much for being here today. We'll start off with your presentation and then have a Q&A.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm seeing so many old friends, it's great. I'm a bit mortified by the 40 years, but it's true. When this building first took in the FCC, it took me in too. But that has nothing to do with today, except that I never imagined I'd be back here later to talk about a book. Now, the point of the PowerPoint is to remind me what to tell you about. But I think many of you here as journalists will understand that in the first place, you start a book because there's a story that you know is there, but it's untold. That there's been all kinds of stuff going on, but it's been ignored, it hasn't been written about, and so it's in a kind of a way, it's a sort of a scoop, except it's on a historical time frame. The other connection with journalism is that it's an investigative process. I mean, this took 10 years and took very good friends who know lots more than I do about some aspects in the book. But it means that you spend a lot of time kind of pulling a thread and wondering where you're going to end out with it, and practicing all these sort of journalistic skills of encirclement, you know, knowing that you want to get a certain person and how to get to them and get to maybe their daughter or their grandmother or somebody else, and then gradually, step by step, get to who you really want. Or you just front up to total strangers and force intimacies out of them. I mean, these are presumably all journalistic skills still, right? So they've all been vital in the making of this book. And part of, okay, so I'm just showing you this to show that even when we talk about Westerners, we've got real cultural schism here. You know, the very sort of fat-lipped version on the right is, of course, the American design, and the one on the left is the British covered design, but I mean, it's entirely the same book. This thing is not central enough. Okay, so here, this was another motivation to get going on this subject, because when you start talking about the many different peoples that went into the making of Hong Kong, what is often forgotten, and what again is not often in the record, is the somewhat vital role played by women. I mean, obviously, they actually produced the people I'm talking about. Often through no choice of their own, but were nonetheless here from the very earliest days of what I still call the colony. And they were in various different ways working quite hard for the money. In different formats, sometimes as moitai, as domestic helpers on the left, sometimes in brothels, and sometimes as protected women, one of these marvelous euphemisms, which sometimes was right. I mean, there were some nice guys who did protect their women. There were quite a lot of other Western or indeed other traders who left them literally holding the baby. Now, the point of all of this is that those babies grew up and were in many ways among the very first indigenous Hong Kongers. I mean, they were born here. They weren't born in China and came over later, or as you know, the majority of Hong Kong Chinese were until after World War II, by the way. You didn't have a majority of Hong Kong-born Chinese until after World War II. That kind of shocked me when I found that out. So what happens is that you get things like this. Now, somebody told me this was a mind map, but I think that's sort of overstating it, really. This is in a very early stage of the process, but this example, it's not really possible to see it big enough. Is this a thingy? Is this point? No, it doesn't. Okay, so up in the top left, you see you've got 4 Lam sisters in pen. I mean, Lam Fong Q, Q Fong. Imagine that, by the way, and they were twins. So think about the records there. How many mistakes have been made as to, you know, who these girls were with at what time and which girl we're talking about. Now, they themselves, this is all in the 1850s, Hong Kong. They themselves were Eurasians. See, father is, we think, a Spanish guy, Mr. Bartu, and someone who we only know as Ms. Lam. We don't even have her full name. And this is often the case, and it's still the case in many of the oldest families of Hong Kong today. There's one of my favorites are still actually paying grave maintenance for 2 women because they're not quite sure which one is the great-great-great-grandma. It could be either or. I mean, it's hard to say. So anyway, we've got Batu and Lam. We've got the 4 daughters. And they had relationships, if you want to call them that, with different traders. Some were American, some were British, but some were, for example, once you jump across through the pink connection to the red, Choi is overseas Chinese from Malacca. I mean, that family was the Capitan China under the, in the Malay trading world, which Philip Bowring has written about. And they came here to be compradors at Taikoo Sugar, and they also intermarried. Now, I mean, the details, believe me, a nightmare. I spent years making messes like this. But the point of this drawing is that by the bottom line of the page, you get all these names. Look at that: Botelho, Coatwell, Choi, Lobo, Belilios, Overbeck, Lee. I mean, I've just covered at least half a dozen different ethnic groups, and you're talking about the early 20th century elite of Hong Kong, and this is where it came from. Now, these things haven't been traced for lots of reasons, and I honestly don't have it all sorted yet. I learn something new every time I do a talk. If there's a descendant, and they say, "Oh," like, "Oh, why didn't you tell me before?" So, if you see in the green in the middle, there's Marie Felice, and we're going to see her mum in a moment, and we're going to learn more about Belilios even now. Thanks to dear Howard, who visited this grave a couple of months ago in Golders Green in London. We have a reference to one of my favorite guys who's very important for the kind of larger point I'm trying to make here. Belilios is from a family, a Jewish family of Venice. His parents went to Calcutta, were very big in opium, and he, young Belilios here, married his Jewish wife in Calcutta. And then he came here in the 1860s to pursue his trade in opium, and sure enough got to know a very nice Chinese lady, and had a whole series of children with her. Later on, it got a bit kind of complicated because Jewish wife from Calcutta also turned up in Hong Kong. But on the other hand, it kind of wasn't complicated. He literally openly ran parallel lives. He kept both families going. They both grew at the same time. And there was no, I mean, of course, him being the bloke was obviously helpful, that there was no problem for him. He was on the board of the bank. He was a member of LegCo. So we're talking a serious pillar of what you might think is the so-called British establishment, but he's a Venetian Jew with a Chinese family. And there's a whole other sort of mind map or messy page, whatever you want to call it, just tracing his children with his Chinese woman. And again, we don't know enough about her, but anyway, the children gradually become incredibly important figures. They're running not just the opium syndicate, but the Tunghua Hospital Group. They're taking serious high positions in Hong Kong society. And so Belilios's family, Hong Kong family, is incredibly important. The point here, though, is that A, he could run a parallel life and it didn't affect his career at all. B, when he went to Britain at the turn of the 19th into 20th century and died in Britain, and there were all these obituaries of him in the Times, because he, well, anyway, he's got a great personality. They were obituaries of him. They only mention his official wife and his official children. They only list his official world. The whole other half, which I would say was really his other 2/3, is just not there. It's whitewashed out of the record. It's not mentioned. So I like to kind of extrapolate from that thought and think about all the other guys and how many other parallel families have been sort of wiped out of the record that we don't know about. And I mean, some of us, we know we're going to be busy for decades if we want to track all of this and try to find out. But the point is, there was a whole lot more going on of this mixing than recognized. Now, some of the very old, let's call them elite Eurasian families, and some of you know them or are related here, are saying, why did you talk about all these other people? And call them Eurasians as well. Well, basically, as I got more involved in this whole story, the guy on the left, the white moustache and no hair, is of course Paul Chater. And I mean, he's Armenian, but his family was generations in Calcutta. And he turns up here in the 1860s, and he single-handedly, not single-handedly, but he is crucial to dragging Hong Kong into the 20th century. I mean, he created the whole prior reclamation. He created all the companies that you all live off. I mean, Hong Kong Land, Hong Kong Electric, Hong Kong Telephone. I mean, it's just like, it's all Chater. And his very good friend, Mr. Modi, who is, of course, Parsi. Now, these guys are also crucial, and also their friends and their relatives and their networks. And they all came to Hong Kong. So how do I include all this when I'm doing a so-called history of Eurasians of Hong Kong? Well, redefine the word Eurasian. And in my book, it's basically the continent, the geographical continent, because then I can include Armenia, Persia, Iraq for Baghdadi Jews. I can cover everybody, and every different kind of Indian, Malay, Manila men. Well, they're not quite the continent, that's archipelago, but whatever. So I've included everybody, and I've quite brutally and explained myself, and please forgive me, of course, for kind of, on the whole, ignoring the Chinese majority, because I kind of think they've been covered, but this side hadn't been covered. That's Chater's house, by the way, Marble Hall, back in the day. So you can see he did well. Now, I've only got 20 minutes, so I'm going to whiz on. Now, this was Felice's mum. Did you remember in the green on the map and the mess? I mean, isn't she a stunner? And I mean, she's got, if you sort of want to deconstruct the looks, you can see there's a bit of everything going on there. And it's Major Samuel Macumber Churn. He's from the family that still maintain the two graves because they're not sure who his mum was. And when I interviewed his 90-year-old son, a third name came up, which was really quite startling to the rest of the family. So it's now, and here's another brilliant example of someone who came out of these mixed roots that are not covered, and of course, obvious reason for not covering it in the families themselves is that for many generations, and I think really until now it's easing off, but there's been this element of shame that, oh, you have to kind of admit that great, or however many grandma, was a sex worker, was a hooker. So, lots of families haven't wanted to have to say that. I think they should. I think they should be proud of women like that one. These were not insignificant characters. They were very strong women. And the crucial thing is, even though often left holding the baby without any visible means of support, they put these kids into what Hong Kong already had then, before Shanghai, which were multiracial schools, multi-ethnic schools. I mean, Central School was teaching in Urdu and Portuguese as well as in Chinese and English. I mean, it was a far more mixed society in the first 100 years than we've been led to believe by, frankly, either the standard British histories or the current Chinese. So you get people like this, bright younger boys. Well, actually, not all of them were bright. But anyway, Ho Kam Tong and Ho Fuk's sons from the Ho Tung. And this is a Ho Kam Tong concubine. Now, she's definitely not in a brothel or anything. She's got the highest status you can have unless you're married. I'm not sure it's something to envy, though, but nevertheless. This is one of the Ho Tung weekend houses on the south side, where the American club now is, the American Country Club. There was a whole line of 3 of these villas. And I suppose there's a clue. It's the same year that I joined the FCC that I actually was living in Stanley, and I even then had a boyfriend who was a photographer. And I said, we've got to photograph these houses. They're not going to last. And so we climbed over the fence. I didn't even know who these families were at the time. But this was the kind of life, and this was built in, I think, 1904, 5. I can't quite read on the photo. But so these kids from what you might call obscure origins did quite well. And here is Robert Ho Tung. There's another whole subject here about how, of course, when you have different origins to hand, you can choose. He chooses to identify as Chinese, whereas clearly you look at his bones. We have Dutch man in the audience. You know his father's Dutch. But he was one of the ones who ran off and left Mum holding this baby, Robert Ho Tung, who's in the centre of the picture. Next to him is George Bernard Shaw. And what I find hilarious is that, they could swap clothes. I mean, there wouldn't be that much difference between the actual look. So the point is, identity is something you can choose, and you can choose to play with. And you can choose to be Chinese when it suits you. You can choose to be something else when it maybe, if you want to be knighted, it's probably good to be British, but whatever. So that's Robert Ho Tung. There's a lot to say about him. Now, third from the left in the front row, he's an interesting guy. Now, he looks a bit different, right? That's Robert Coatwell. And that's because his father is Parsi. And his mum was Chinese, and he was brought up more by mum, so he was fluent in Chinese. And then you get this marvelous anomaly in a way. Well, I think maybe it's not an anomaly, but he was the representative of the Chinese in the Legislative Council before the war. So he's the highest ranking in terms of government position before World War II. Robert Ho Tung's still on the far left. So war comes. Now, some of us already know what that's like. You're kind of forced to make decisions about really, now it kind of matters. Now it's a matter of life and death, who you are. I mean, if you previously said, oh, I'm Macanese or something, no, all of a sudden, let's be Portuguese. Let's go to the consul's house in Kowloon Tong, get a passport, and quickly get to Macau and meet Consul Reeves, who you mentioned in a forthcoming talk. So, because it was real sort of Casablanca in Macau during the war. It was fascinating. Or there were some families that are completely intermarried, Portuguese, Chinese, and others. And the Chinese side had previously looked down on the Portuguese, and all of a sudden, the status stakes had flipped. But for men like Robert Coatwell, he's a really interesting case because he's high up in the government, and the British asked him to stay on and deal with the Japanese. So, which he did, and which he got an immense amount of stick for. I'm brutalizing, summarizing brutally here. He was later accused of being a collaborator, but of course, all these people you've seen, and all of us here and now, are to some extent collaborators. We're making do with the situation. He was in a very sticky one where he felt himself, he's racially half Parsi, half Chinese. He was representing the British. He was die-hard loyal to the British. He dealt with the Chinese. He gave some sort of over-enthusiastic banzais from time to time. And he got a lot of criticism from, get this, other Eurasians. Not actually from the British. The British later sort of, it's messy, we'll let him go. He did not have a post-war career. It's a bit of a tragedy. But, a relative of his used his double identity to, first of all, be British and fight in Hong Kong against the Japanese, and then to be Chinese to get out of prisoner of war camp and work at the Rosary Hill Refuge for all sorts of mixed race, interesting people, which is another story which is out there in the book. And then snuck behind Chinese lines and was British again to get to Chongqing to make a report on what was happening in Hong Kong. It's all in the same family. And it's really interesting. Some of these stories, of course, even now are quite sensitive. But I hope that it's kind of getting less, because I want more of these stories to come out. I just find them really interesting, and I want all these families to get busy and keep their records. Now this photo the other night, this was great. There was somebody in the audience, and she said, "Oh, that's me." The little flower girl on the left is today's Countess von Pfeil. She was. This is the marriage of the daughter of Robert Coatwell. That's Patsy marrying John Fenton. And if you just look at the crowd, look at the variation. You've got traditional Chinese, you've got traditional Western, you've got variations in between, and pretty well. This is why by the end of doing this book, I'd reach this point that I think we're all Eurasian now. Now, this is a kind of crossover from pre-war to post-war. They were absolutely nothing before the war, but another example of how Hong Kong at least was always open to all comers, and anyone could come here and give it a go. And this is for the coronation of Elizabeth, so it's another statement of identity. But I think, oh yes, now this is of course by another club member, Hugh Van Ness, the late great. This is 1967. So once I got an American publisher for this book, he said, "Well, you've got to bring it up to date." And I'm saying, no, it's a history book. He said, no, you've got to have an epilogue. So suddenly you've got 70 years sort of crushed into one little chapter at the back. Because at what point do Hong Kong's mixed peoples say it's time to go? Because weirdly enough, it was not World War II. A lot of Hong Kong's peoples, who by then, for them, several generations, Hong Kong was home. They were real Hong Kongers. And they saw themselves as such, and this was their home. They had no other place, and they had no thoughts about ever needing any other place. They even were prepared, and often did, to fight and indeed died for Hong Kong. All these people who had no particular reason to love the British, except that it had opened up a place for them to be themselves. And they were committed to that idea. And what I found, and it's weird, every time I start on this, I get goosebumps, but they really had an idea of Hong Kong, which survived World War II, that they really, honestly, laid down their lives for, and they came back after World War II, all these people I'm talking about. Some of them left in 1967. That was a moment that they thought, maybe it's not so, maybe we need to start hedging. And I think I'll just go really quickly, because I've gone over time. These were a few other moments when people felt that maybe they should start hedging. And that's the end of the book.
Thank you so much. I want to get into audience questions, but I'll just ask a couple to start. One is, what are some of the misconceptions about the early years of Hong Kong that are addressed in the book, or things that surprised you in the course of your research?
Well, it took me a while to get the courage up. You know, when you're a journalist and you think sort of academics are the fount of all pure knowledge, and then after a bit you deal more with academics and you sort of then think the other way maybe. But anyway, it took me a long while to get the courage up to sort of start contradicting some of the most venerable names in Hong Kong history. I mean, and honestly, I apologize to James Hayes, because he's done brilliant work on the new territories and all sorts of marvelous research. But he has this line about how Hong Kong is a tale of two cities. That Hong Kong has worked because you've got the British over here and the Chinese over here. Now, you know, who are the British? What do you mean by British? I mean, all these people might have said they were British, but, you know, so define that. And then who are the Chinese? You mean the ones who came with the British because it backed them in the First Opium War? Or do you mean all the others who came later? Or, you know, so who are these two groups? That's one thing. And then he says, you know, it works because they both live totally separate lives and have nothing to do with each other. It's a tale of two cities. And, I mean, the short summary is, of course, that a whole lot of them were sleeping together most nights. So, you know, he kind of missed that. So I think that was the main sort of point.
And can you tell us a little bit about how you did your research, some of the resources or places you went and people you talked to?
Yeah, I want to put in a plug here for why this government should pass an archives law. China has an archives law. Hong Kong has been sitting on their idea for more than a decade, and the Law Reform Commission is apparently still thinking about it. And what that means is that there are great archives, sorry to be blunt about this, up to 97. I mean, they're not all here, but, you know, you can access stuff. Since then, if you really want to check all kinds of records, you're going to have trouble, because although there are recommendations that government departments or chief executives should send all their papers to the Public Records Office, there's no actual law that requires them to do so. So guess what? Lots of it doesn't reach the Public Records Office. Anyway, that's Vaudine's little shtick for the day. Most important when you're researching anything about the people of Hong Kong is this amazing guy, Carl Smith, who's no longer with us, and who, luckily for me, I mean, I didn't find it lucky at the time that my parents were church-going missionaries, but luckily they went to church with Carl Smith, and they'd bring Carl Smith back for lunch on Sundays. This is in 1979, I think. And Carl was an absolutely obsessive, adorable nutter. I mean, he decided to track who everybody was in Hong Kong. He sat down with all the old newspapers, and you know, back in the day when we had newspapers and there were things like birth, death, and marriage notices. I mean, think about how vital that is for when you want to track who's who. And so he made a note of it. Every single person has an index card. And literally, if, you know, this is all pre-internet life, right? Okay, he's doing it by hand on index cards. He lived in Mei Fu. Every wall was covered in these drawers that are just the right size for index cards. I mean, I get goosebumps again. I mean, every single job I've ever done on anything historical, you go first to Carl and you see, oh, so Noel Croucher, a white guy, was a clerk in the post office in 1905 at the age of 15. So, you know, you find stuff that you don't find anywhere else that's incredibly difficult to get to. He sat in the land registry. He tracked a lot of these protected women. I mean, the lucky ones who had good guys, these guys would leave them a flat on Peel Street. I mean, think about that. And that was the zone, what we now call Soho or NoHo or whatever. That was where some of the brothels were, but where some of these women also had kind of sisterhood houses. I mean, there's just so many other stories you can do. Once you start on this, there's about 10 other books in here. But just these women and their sisterhood houses, you know, they start with one flat gifted, and then they manage to get together and get another one next door, and it grows. And anyway, Carl Smith, he's crucial. He tracked a lot of this in the beginning. Archives are crucial. And then, well, the kindness of strangers, definitely, but also some very good friends. So some of you will remember Robin Hutchin, who was the boss, was my editor at the South China Morning Post in 1983. His wife is Shanghai Eurasian. And he said, "Why aren't you talking to Dawn?" And I said, "Dawn, why?" "Well, she's Eurasian." "Really?" And it turns out Dawn is a great niece of that guy, Major Samuel Churn, and I'd worked with her on the Post, and I'd never sort of thought in those days about who she was. And then I tracked her down sort of 35 years later, and she had all her trees, and she introduced me to her family. So, you know, persistence, being a nerd, having good friends, that sort of thing.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Anyone have a question? Yes, Philip.
Yeah.
It's going to be tricky.
Philip Bowering, a journalist and historian. If I can ask two questions. The first is, did you come across anything about Caldwell in your researches? The first, I think, British officially married to a Chinese in the 1850s. And my second question is, assuming that any of the current leaders of Hong Kong actually read your book, or hopefully it will be translated into Chinese, what lessons need they learn?
Another former boss of mine. Yes, about Caldwell. Chapter 4 is mainly Caldwell. He was this amazing guy. I mean, British? People doubted it because he was so, quote unquote, close to the Chinese. He was born on St. Helena, so he grew up around Southeast Asia, so he didn't actually go to the right schools, but, you know, was he? You know, so already definitional problems arise. But then, indeed, as you rightly note, he is the first to actually go so far as to marry his Chinese lady love. Not only in a Chinese cemetery, but a few years later at St. John's with the bishop. And, you know, this whole idea you get, it was so frowned upon and it was all impossible. I mean, going back to your first quote, well, it wasn't. They did it. I mean, it happened. So, and it turns out she was quite the godbotherer and had her own in-house priest and had lots of kids and, you know, all the Caldwell kids. But Caldwell is an essential guy for early Hong Kong. And why? Because he speaks 2 different Chinese dialects, Hindustani, Malay, and some Portuguese. And the government, although they tried to get rid of him, they didn't approve at different times, whatever, they could not function without him. Now, what does that tell you? I mean, it tells you that it was not just a bunch of Brits and Chinese. So Caldwell is fascinating. He's really crucial. Second question. The point here is that if you want your city to be a functioning, living community, port city, you need to be open to all peoples. You need to be the kind of place that these people want to come to. I mean, nobody told these people to come. And nobody told the vast majority of Chinese people to come either, by the way. You know, the population of Hong Kong is, I mean, 99.9% self-selected. People chose to come. And they brought with them, I mean, not just personality and enterprise, but they brought their networks. I mean, if you're a Parsi, you're born with a ticket to ride. I mean, you're born into a global trading network of other Parsis right across and around the world that was incredibly important and that was ever multiplying, and that, you know, had its own intelligence links, had its own language. I mean, it's not just that a couple of random people came. They brought their networks. So you need to be the kind of place that is open to people of different faiths, of different skin color, let's be blunt, of different cultures, and they need to be able to, I mean, not only go ye forth and multiply, but actually, you know, live rich, diverse lives. Now, what's the consistent parts of all of that is different for each individual. I left 3 years ago, so.
Yes, question here?
Just a couple of more points. Paul Murray, I'm a retired doctor, and interesting people in the past in Hong Kong, which are not of the expected mould. One was Hennessy, who was the governor of Hong Kong in the, I think, mid to slightly later than that, 1800s.
1877 plus, yeah.
But he was quite a revolutionary person, considering his times from Victorian England, an Irish Catholic from County Cork, related through the generations to Hennessy Cognac, who was a hired hand in the European wars.
And this governor married a Eurasian.
Sorry?
Your Hennessy married a Eurasian.
He was and he fought here to open up clubs, restaurants, jobs to Chinese people.
He got a lot of trouble for it.
And he got in, yes, he made himself persona non grata through this. Interesting that he was a protege of Disraeli, another unlikely mid-Victorian prime minister, who was a dynamic creature at the time of just before Gladstone, I think. And another thing too, the end of the Second World War, tiny population of Hong Kong, I think you just mentioned that, less than 1 million.
Yeah, there were 1.6 million people in Hong Kong at the beginning of World War II, and there were 600,000 left alive.
And lured here by the prospect of new hope, jobs, everything. This genius who did it, Cowperthwaite I think his name was, who opened up Hong Kong to free trade and to make it a place where people could build.
Yeah, what I need to stress here is that I'm not saying that the British were so marvellous that they made it so terrific and everything. My strong impression that I get from going through all kinds of records is that, you know, as regards Hong Kong and the British, I mean, the mountains were high and the emperor really was far away. I mean, a lot of the time the British really, it's sort of unintended consequences. I mean, they let it open and they didn't actually care about a lot of the details, and they didn't. And I think a lot of, you know, after years on this, I mean, what I call my people, a lot of them came back after the war. Not because Hong Kong was British, but still, I have to say this, because it was not Chinese. So it was still a separate, and it's nothing against China either. It was more that it was a non-state entity.
Offered hope.
Yeah, but it was kind of in-between place, so it's ideal for in-between people. And the minute you're part of a nation state, your nature changes. So, you know, and the world, I mean, you look at global history over hundreds of years, you need places in both particular moments of geographical and chronological time that are grey zones in one way or another. They are in between. And I think, you know, once a place, it's like Trieste. I mean, I've talked before about having a Triestean feeling. You know, it has a moment in the sun where it's an absolute throbbing, heaving hub port. You know, people are going from there to Shanghai and God knows where. And then, you know, the sort of tectonic plates of empire around it shift, and it's a backwater. So, you know, places come and go. But at that moment, yes, hopes were high. And actually, sorry, just on Disraeli, our friend Belilios, he was a manic fan of Disraeli. He sent flowers, was it violets or something, to the grave of Disraeli? And if some of you remember Beaconsfield Arcade, well, that's Disraeli, that's the Earl of Beaconsfield, and that was built by Belilios. So, you know, he was a super fan of Disraeli. It was kind of funny. There's lots of funny stories.
Do we have any questions from the veranda?
Veranda. Hello, veranda. Nah, they're fine.
All right, well, I'll ask aside from reading your book, copies of which are available over there, what suggestions do you have for people who would like to learn more about Hong Kong history if they're just getting started, places they should check out, or places from your book that people might know but might not know the history of, places around here?
Wow. I mean, this doesn't sound like fun, but it can be really interesting. I mean, cemeteries are great. There's the Jewish cemetery, and there are people there, and you start to think, oh, what's their story? You know, that can lead. There's a Eurasian cemetery. There's Parsi sections. I mean, of course, originally Parsis don't want to be in a cemetery. They want to go back to the temples of silence in Bombay. But so, in terms of sort of walking around, that would be something I would do if it wasn't raining. Books. Well, yeah, Carl Smith still had a couple of these. I mean, there's not enough. They've been reprinted by Hong Kong University Press, but they're still obscure and they're still hard to find. A Sense of History by Carl Smith. It's a series of short chapters that, you know, will tell you, for example, the actual origins of Sai Ying Pun. You know, who was there first? You know, landlot by landlot. I mean, that kind of thing. He's a guy who really sought truth from facts. I mean, he gets down to the brass tacks. And the beginnings of Wan Chai, the beginnings of these different areas. I mean, there's this whole world that I love of these. I guess this says more about me, but back in the mid-19th century, there were all these bars sort of stretching west of Central, so along Queen's Road West, you know, and they're like the land we live in, or, you know, the world, and they're sort of marvelous names, and yeah. And this is where a whole lot of this mixing, obviously, also took place. I mean, I'm not only going on about elite families in this book, they become, some of them become, and some of them don't. But the ones who really pioneered are guys who were running a pub and married the woman who was helping them run it, and they did it in a church or in a chapel, often more chapel than church. So Carl Smith tells you where to go for these things. But there are other books. God, tell me, what should I recommend people to read? Yeah, thank you. Howard here is the expert on the Jewish cemetery, by the way, if you need to know. Patricia Lim has done this book called Forgotten Souls, and it's a kind of a compilation of, you know, all the graves in the main big cemetery, you know, by the racetrack. And who were these people? And, you know, what did they do? Where did they come from? And after a while, you kind of find, well, you know, none of us here are so weird. You know, it's all been done before. And you can sort of trace back, if you sort of, something that I thought of often when I was doing this was, gosh, I wonder where I would have ended up if I was suddenly here in the 1850s. I mean, you kind of think about that. Missionary daughter. Maybe I'd gone AWOL in China, or maybe I would have ended up, you know, on Lyndhurst Terrace in a sort of house of ill repute. I've no idea. But the fact is, all of us here and now are connected to these stories of these people before us, and, you know, a lot of us came here for similar reasons. And if you're feeling that you're part of a Hong Kong, which is a place that is different to its neighbours, and why is it different? Well, I think it's worth looking at that and finding out more about it, yeah. But there's lots of books, but there's not enough in print. There should be more racy novels.
I think we'll take one last question from Philip. Oh, did I miss? Okay, we'll do one more question after Philip then.
Sorry, folks.
Whether you could make any comparison between Hong Kong and Singapore, because they were both founded for the same reason, which is British free trade. And they both, you know, assembled different groups of people, but were they essentially the same, do you think? And do you think Singapore now has lessons to teach Hong Kong in that direction?
Ooh, I don't know I'd go that far. Philip sounds like my professor in Leiden. He wants me to sort of come out with some beautiful conclusion. I think there are differences, and I guess this is, I mean, I still prefer the Hong Kong model. Singapore, and as you know, Malay states, the stray settlements and everything, the Brits imported, you know, sort of specific, I mean, consciously, deliberately imported specific groups for this and for that. You know, you had the Chettiers to come and do that level of management. You had the Chinese to come and do the mines and run the opium syndicates and so on. You had the Malays to do this and that. And it was much more, in my view, regimented. And of course, Singapore has become much more, I mean, it is, of course, in many ways, a much more consciously Chinese city, and that's integral to its founding, to its separation from Malaya. And so they are just more sort of conscious and deliberate about it. So there is a government-supported Eurasian society in Singapore, which is sort of saying, you know, wanting to say that we, Singapore, you know, this is not a very clear argument. I haven't done enough work on it yet, says Professor. But it's more deliberate and conscious sort of categorization of you're here for this, you're here for that, you're here for something else. Whereas here, I get the feeling it was much more free-for-all. And frankly, I think the first Brits who came here and opened it up, I don't think they were expecting all these odds and sods to follow. So, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. Singapore now has a national narrative which is very focused on saying, you know, we are multi-ethnic, we are multicultural. And there's a brilliant book of Singapore, actually. It's called A Biography of Singapore by Mark Ravinder Frost. And it totally emphasizes the multi-ethnic, multicultural roots that have gone into it. But of course, it's something that for longer in Singapore than here has been quite deliberately channeled by a government view. I don't know that answers, but anyway, somebody else has
And our last question over here.
Hi.
Vaudine, thank you for a fascinating talk.
And thank you for your footnote.
Now, I think you presented very well how Hong Kong became the success that it became because it was open and inviting, and people from around the world came here to make Hong Kong their home and establish their businesses here. Now, looking at Hong Kong today, do you think that Hong Kong is still open and inviting and attractive to people around the world that they would want to come here? Or I mean, currently, the last few years, for instance, it seems like there has been an exodus of non-Chinese from Hong Kong. Can you comment on that and what it bodes for the future?
Every talk, somebody asks me this. I'm getting better at answering. Thanks, Frank. I mean, the short answer is, well, I left. So what do you think? But to be a bit more thoughtful, I've asked a lot of the people I've been interviewing over all these years. You know, you don't just sort of rock up to what some of these people in the book and sit them down and get their story and never see them again. You have to build relationships over the years. And so I asked them, and one of them spoke for several at a dinner table once, and he said, well, we all know that we were second class under the British, but we know we're third class now. I mean, that's in the book, so, I mean, I hope I'm not locking myself up, but I think there is an issue, and I think the larger issue, the broader point, is what room do, for example, nationality laws allow for people of diverse origins? I mean, it was a real issue, it's no secret, from the 80s and 90s that when we were all looking toward the handover, that, you know, who was going to have passports that would allow them to actually stay in Hong Kong? Because in the beginning, the Chinese line was, well, you know, all Hong Kong Chinese are Chinese. Well, fine, but what if you're a Hong Konger and you're not Chinese? So then what? You know, and there were huge lobby groups. I mean, the Harry Leilas and the Narain, another Sindhi family, were extremely active in lobbying for, you know, their community that goes back to the beginnings of Hong Kong, to say, well, you know, we're also part of Hong Kong. We also want to stay, and to make that possible. Now, I think that with Chinese nationality law there are problems, and for many of the people I'm talking about, and of course the wealthy ones have already long ago hedged and diversified and got other passports, but I think that is an issue, and it has to be a choice made by every individual. And for people deciding, you know, what's important to them in their lives, what they need. I mean, many of my multi-generational families, I mean, they know no other life than Hong Kong. It has been the home for everything they have ever known. And it is, in a way, impossible to leave. But your kids, I mean, that's for everybody else to decide. It's not for me to say. Does that answer you?
Talking about nationality, I think people in Hong Kong are very flexible. You know, you mentioned Togol. When the British were in charge, he called himself British.
Yeah.
When the Japanese came, he was no longer British, he was Chinese.
Mm.
After the Japanese left, he became British again.
Mm. But all the time under the British, he was the representative of the Chinese, so he was covering all bases. Yes, but no, you're right, of course. Mm-hmm. So you think it is flexible and open?
And they help the Parsi or Chinese, they travel to China on a home return permit, and when they go overseas, they use a foreign passport. So people in Hong Kong, I think, are very...
Well, you've answered your own question, then. That's fine. It is still fine. It's all fine.
I think we have to cut it off there, but they're available right over there, and the author is here to sign them.
Dear friend.
And please do pick up a copy, and thank you all so much for coming, and see you at our other events. Have a great day.
Thank you, darling.
Thank you.